Hello, true crimerers. This is going to be another compilation video. I have so many golden videos on TikTok that I can probably make 8,000 compilations. Today's theme of video is worst freak accidents. This is the spin-off series I did for worst deaths imaginable. So these are going to be like freak accidents that either affected one person or a whole bunch of people. And I have, I believe I have 50 of them on my TikTok, but these are going to be 20 of those cases. And I'll do another one of these of this theme, as well as more worst deaths imaginable compilations and all the other themes I have. So there will be plenty more coming. These videos don't really take like much time or effort to make. So I can just put these together in a few minutes. So without further ado, here are 20 of the worst freak accidents. Viewer discretion is it. Worst freak accidents number 1. Hello, true crimerers. I'm throwing in a new series covering horrific and tragic accidents that have led to either death or serious injury. And today we're going to Kansas City, Missouri. Specifically to the Hyatt Regency Hotel, which is now known as the Sheraton Kansas City Hotel at Crown Center. The hotel, which at one point was Missouri's tallest building, it opened on July 1st, 1980. This was the lobby of the Crown Plaza Hotel when it opened. Pictured here on the right, you'll see 2 walkways. There was one walkway for the second floor and one walkway for the 4th floor. Now, I'm obviously not a structural engineer, so if you want to know the specifics of how this was put together, I would recommend you go online to look at it. I don't want to waste your time with it. Just know that the original design in the blueprints for these walkways is different than what they actually constructed. And the updated construction they went with would prove to be incredibly fatal. On July 17th, 1981, there was nearly 1,700 people in the lobby and in the atrium of the hotel. This was going to be for a tea dance. That just sounds like some sort of old people festival, I don't know. But it was packed. There were approximately 40 people on the 2nd floor walkway at about 7:05 p.m. More than that were on the 3rd floor walkway, which is actually off-centered from these 2 walkways, and then an estimated 20 people on the 4th floor walkway. All of a sudden, there were some popping noises. Initially, people thought they were the balloons popping, when suddenly the 4th floor walkway dropped, then it stopped, and then it fell completely, crashing into the 2nd floor walkway, which then the weight was too much, and so that walkway then collapsed as well. What happened was the steel hanger rods, which in the original plan was to have 2 very long steel hanger rods, they instead used 2 short steel hanger rods for each bridge. Well, the bolts holding them in completely ripped through the little box. Again, I'm not a structural engineer. The rescue operation lasted 14 hours. Hundreds of people were buried. And we're talking buried under concrete and steel, and glass shattered everywhere. Many people died instantly when the bridge collapsed on top of them. It's said that some of the dead bodies were in the way of the still living people, so the rescue team had to dismember the dead bodies in order to get the alive people out. Some of the living people had to get immediate amputations in order to be freed. And then the sprinkler system failed, which then flooded the room. Some people who were trapped actually drowned. It was unbelievable and utter chaos. Here's another look at some of the damage. 116 people died that night. 216 people were severely injured. No one was held criminally responsible, but many lawsuits came. It was awful. Worst freak accidents number 2. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. This was 14-year-old Trey Cooley. Trey and his father Butch would do everything together. They fished together, they hunted together, they even went to the shooting range together. And that is where our unfortunate story takes us today. This was the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club in Carrollton, Texas. And on September 29th, 1991, a horrible accident would occur. Trey tagged along with his father Butch to the club that morning. Butch was judging a shooting contest. Now, Trey was sitting inside the air gun range when all of a sudden, a bullet struck the side of his head and killed him. Butch, his father, was just feet away outside and had to see the unfortunate carnage. At first, they didn't know if someone deliberately shot the boy or if it was something that came from outside. What actually happened, I don't think you could even possibly recreate. In the outside portion of the shooting range where actual, guns were being fired and where the shooting contest was happening, a man by the name of Dan Smith was using one of his modified guns. Now, if you can see the little guy right there, this is a model. So he steps in front of the first barrier there because he needed to shoot from 15 yards away. So he's now in this portion of the firing range. And this building here right behind it is where Trey was sitting. Now, there's supposed to be several layers of protection to prevent bullets from going anywhere past the range. Most importantly is a berm right here, this grassy hill. The berm is supposed to be 20 feet high. This one was only 12. And from the 15-yard position, you could literally see the building that Trey was sitting in. And like they say, if you can see it, you can shoot it. Not to mention the wood planks of the barrier, they have like giant open cracks. And there was no steel plate behind him, which was supposed to be there. So when Dan Smith fired his weapon, on the recoil, another bullet shot out, which he didn't even know occurred. The bullet then goes through this crack here, goes 3 inches over the berm, enters the building right here in this wall. It then goes through a storage closet, misses this broom and these pipes by mere centimeters right there. It then hits the ceiling of the next area. It then skids 7 inches across the ceiling, and instead of going upwards through the ceiling, and by the way, the bullet's traveling at 1,200 feet per second at this point. When it hits the ceiling, it does the unthinkable. It changes directions, slows down to 900 feet per second, goes through another wall, goes past the air gun range, and strikes Trey Cooley in the side of the head. This is like 1 in a billion. If he's in a different spot by like an inch, he's fine. The family filed a lawsuit against the gun range, and they won $3 million, but lost their son. First freak accidents number 3. The Compilation cable car crash. Viewer discretion advised, and hello, true crimerers. Let's talk about it. February 3rd, 1998, in Compilation, Italy. 19 passengers and 1 cable car operator were aboard a cable car that looked identical to this, on a regular trip up the mountain that's been done thousands and thousands of times. But they could not possibly foresee what was about to happen. United States Marines Captain Richard Ashby and Captain Joseph Schweitzer, they were conducting a low-altitude training mission in a United States Marines Prowler aircraft, and at a speed of 540 miles per hour and an altitude somewhere around 300 feet, well, the right wing of the plane would fly directly into the cable holding up the cable car, and it severed the cable in half, which then unfortunately meant the cable car fell. And it fell about 260 feet, or 80 meters. The cable car would unfortunately crash into the ground at high speed, and the thing just obliterated. And unfortunately, all 20 people aboard the cable car would die. And from what I've been able to read, they all died instantaneously. 3 of the passengers were Italian, but all the other passengers were tourists from other countries. Now, in Italy, where this took place, this training exercise that was being done by United States Marines was extremely highly criticized. And for good reason, obviously. Now, there were 4 people total in the plane at the time, but only Ashby and Schweitzer would actually go to trial for this. Because after a United States investigation determined they were flying way too low and way too fast, even with the training exercise implemented. They actually broke directives because they were not allowed to fly at the height of cable car cables. In their aircraft, they actually had a map of all the cable car locations in the area. In their aircraft was also an unopened directive that forbade any crafts going below 2,000 feet. These two men also deleted the footage from inside their plane. They would both be charged with 20 counts of involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide. They would be acquitted of those charges. However, they would be found guilty of obstruction of justice and conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman because of the footage they destroyed. They were released from the military. Ashby served 4 months in prison. Schweitzer would not serve time in prison. And that's that. Worst freak accidents number 4. Warning, viewer discretion is advised. And if you're looking for worst freak accidents number 3, it's over on my backup page, which I will put in the comments below. Today we are going to Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor in Sacramento, California, where on September 24th, 1972, a horrific incident would take place. By the way, no, this is not the exact building where this happened because that building was destroyed. The beginning of this story takes place across the street from the Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor at the Sacramento Executive Airport in Sacramento, California, where they were holding a Golden West Sport Aviation Air Show. Just before 4:30 that afternoon, a Canadair Sabre Mach 5, and this was a privately owned jet, and it was being piloted that day by Richard Bingham. As he was going down the runway, he was unable to get enough altitude to fully take off. And as you can see, the pathway here right across the street is the Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor at the time. And because he was unable to fully take off, he overran the runway, he hit a berm, then it crashed through a chain link fence, which is still over on this side. There were 2 underwing fuel tanks, I guess, on the plane, and so when it hit the chain link fence, they ruptured, and it caused this very explosion and this very fireball. And because it was already going at such a high speed, it just continued going across the street. It was going 150 miles per hour, and when it hit the street, it came into contact with a car. And again, trigger warning, potentially upsetting photograph coming. Again, viewer discretion advised. The jet would finally come to a stop when it came into direct contact with the Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor restaurant across the street. The fact that the 2 fuel tanks ruptured and exploded while still at the airport is actually a good thing, if you can imagine, because the catastrophe that would have occurred beyond what already happened would have been significantly worse had they ruptured here at the restaurant. That being said, 22 people lost their lives. This includes 12 children. Richard Bingham, the pilot, he survived. He did break a leg and an arm. There was an elderly couple who was trying to cross the street to see the commotion, and this was after the plane had crashed, and they were both struck by a car, and the wife was killed. Inside the restaurant was absolute chaos and carnage. An 8-year-old boy who survived, he lost 9 family members, including both of his parents and 2 of his grandparents. The National Transportation Safety Board ruled this an accident based on pilot error. Bingham was not held criminally responsible, but his instructor said he never should have been flying that plane. Worst freak accidents number 5, viewer discretion is advised. And hello, true crimerers! Pictured here is the aftermath of the Versailles Wedding Hall collapse. This was in Jerusalem and happened on May 24th, 2001. This side of the building was only ever intended to be a 2-story building. The other side was intended to be a 3-story structure. Well, the people who were constructing the building at the time decided, you know what? They should be even Stevens. So the building that was intended to be 2 stories got another story added to it. Now, the flooring of the 3rd floor would technically have been the roof. And a roof is not intended to carry as much weight as a floor inside of a building. So what they did was they added partitions below this new floor that was intended to hold up the weight. You know, it kind of helped evenly distribute the load bearing. A few weeks before this disaster took place, the owners of the wedding hall portion of this building said, you know what, let's take the partitions out. So they did. The floor began to sag. They looked at it as like it just looks bad, so we'll add something to it. So they filled it with grout, which then inadvertently created more load, and it was put over a weak spot. On May 24th, 2001, a wedding reception was going on. There were close to 500 people in this room. This is from a video that you can actually watch online, but I would just give you some warning. Viewer discretion is advised for watching that video. I'm not going to show it here for obvious reasons. But this is what happened literally moments before disaster. They were having a great time. They were dancing, enjoying life, celebrating the wedding. Within a second of that last frame I showed you, and you can't really see it here, but this is an image of the floor collapsing and all of the people falling with it. And this is what happened. This new third floor completely collapsed. Chaos ensued. People were going all over the place. The debris and the dirt was making it very hard to see. People were running, looking for family members, for loved ones. Where's the bride and the groom? When the floor collapsed, 23 people would die. 380 other people were injured. And this has got to be the luckiest 2 people in the world. In 2001, the engineer of this horrific disaster, his name was Eli Ron, well, he was arrested. And in 2002, he was charged with manslaughter. In October of 2004, 3 of the owners of the wedding hall, they were also arrested. And they were convicted of causing death by negligence. 2 of them were sentenced to 30 months. The other only got 4 months. Eli Ron was sentenced to 4 years. And now the building is demolished. This never needed to happen. Worst freak accidents number 6. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, true crimerers. This is the story of Atiq Rafiq. Now, this story has been making the rounds, I've noticed, on TikTok with that little, few second animation. I thought I would go into more detail. Atiq was a 24-year-old father of a 2-year-old girl. On the evening of March 9th, 2018, Atiq went to see a film at the View Cinemas. And this was in Star City, Birmingham, which is in the UK. Now, this particular theater, like a lot of theaters nowadays, have the electronic chairs with the footrests you can raise, that kind of thing. Some of them even have call buttons to bring waiters and stuff to you. I know we have a few of those here in the United States. So at some point during the movie, Atiq noticed that his keys and his cell phone had fallen somewhere in the chair. I think we've all been there before. So what happened was he knelt down to look under the seat with the footrest raised. For some reason, the footrest began to lower on its own. No one pressed any buttons to make that happen. His wife immediately noticed, and she's trying to lift up the actual seat. It lowered so quickly that he didn't even have time to really realize what was actually going on. But yeah, his wife was there desperately trying to lift it up. He was trying to struggle out of it, but he couldn't. It had completely closed on his neck. There was 3/4 of a ton worth of pressure going onto his neck. So at that point, everyone's freaking out. He is literally stuck and being crushed by this seat. They're in there pressing button, but nothing was working. It was completely malfunctioning. It would later turn out that there was a wiring issue with this seat. So no matter what they did, they were not going to be able to get that seat to rise. An ambulance was called, obviously, and he was stuck under there for 15 minutes with all of that pressure crushing him. This is more like what the seat actually looked like. So after that 15 minutes, the cinema people were able to unscrew the bolts finally to get the footrest off of him. But unfortunately, Atiq would suffer a heart attack due to all of the lack of oxygen he was getting. Atiq would remain alive for roughly a week before he would die in the hospital. His cause of death ultimately was a hypoxic brain injury. They would later find out in an investigation that parts of the mechanisms that were put on there to make this chair work properly, well, they were fitted incorrectly. And none of the seats in this theater were ever actually tested before they went into use. So this particular cinema chain, View, was fined £750,000, which is a little over $1 million US. And View Cinemas took complete blame for the incident. I can't seem to find whether or not his family sued the theater company, so I'm not sure on that. Worst freak accidents number 7. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured behind me is the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, which was founded in 1921. And we're going to travel back in time to May 15th, 1929. On that day, there was a leaky steam pipe in the basement. So they called a steam fitter to come repair it. Now, the basement had been converted to a storage place for the x-rays. Which, by the way, take a look at how old-timey these x-rays used to be. What the hell? Dude is a creep. Anyway, back to sadness. Now, the nitrocellulose film was being stored in filing cabinets. Now, the leaky steam made contact with some of the film. We're talking 3 to 4 tons of film. So what happened was the film began to decompose and then emit a very poisonous gas. And then disaster, when an exposed light bulb sparked, which then came into contact with the poisonous gas, and a massive explosion occurred. The film they used by Kodak was highly volatile, and putting the film out that's on fire is really difficult to do. Like, even water may not have actually helped. Not only did the explosion create a fire in the building, but it also thrust the poisonous gas everywhere. This set into motion a massive rescue operation. The toxic fumes of the gas went through the pipes and then went throughout the entire building. Every single room of the building was hit by gas and hit by fire. It was like a yellow-brown colored smoke. It was in the stairways, which unfortunately trapped a couple hundred people in the building. If you inhaled this poisonous gas, you were dead. The people who did inhale it, their skin changed colors within moments to like a yellow-brown color, and then you would suffocate to death all within minutes. Now, when firemen arrived trying to rescue people, not knowing at the time that water wasn't really going to help put the fire out, all the water did was it created more of the gas to spread. Now people outside of the building were now inhaling the gas. So people who were never there, people who were there just to help rescue, were now dying. And then a second explosion. The building and the area surrounding the building, all of it was a death trap. There were several people in the building who were fortunate enough to escape both the gas and the fire, even those that got trapped by it at first. 123 people died that day. 92 other people were seriously injured. And in today's money, it did about $683,000 worth of damage. What a nightmare. Worst freak accidents, number 8. Viewer discretion is advised. And this is a story about how a targeted attempted homicide would lead to the unintended murder of a completely different person. Pictured behind me was 45-year-old Maribel Cavero Reyes. And on November 2nd, 2016, sometime shortly before 12:50 p.m., she was leaving the apartment of her mother to go pick up her 13-year-old niece. Maribel then walked into the crosswalk when all of a sudden a bystander would say they heard a yelp come out of her and then she fell to the ground. It was clear that she had been shot in the torso, even though no one heard any sounds of gunfire. And sadly, she would pass away. Rewinding the clock back just a few minutes. 2 full city blocks away, 28-year-old Carlos Vasquez was attempting to purchase marijuana from 17-year-old Orlando Oquendo. Something went wrong. Orlando pulled out a 9mm handgun and began chasing Carlos. He then fired the weapon, but he missed his target. The bullet would then travel 2 blocks down 154th Street at roughly 1,300 feet per second. And this is a highly populated, very dense area. There's trees, there's telephone poles, there's vehicles, there's people everywhere. The bullet missed all of it. And it kept going and it kept going. As the road dipped, the bullet began to dip. It whizzed by other people. It began to slow down, and I believe it even at one point tumbled a little bit, until unfortunately it connected with the torso of 45-year-old Maribel Cavero Reyes. The perfectly intact and relatively clean bullet slid underneath a car, but police were baffled because they didn't know who would want to do this. Why would they target her? They were able to begin tracing the bullets from its path upwards of 154th Street. About 2 blocks away, they found a spent shell casing of a 9mm bullet next to a silver-plated lighter. The police would also get a phone call from Carlos Vasquez, saying that he was the intended target of that bullet, and he named names. 17-year-old Orlando Oquendo was then arrested and charged with the murder of Maribel. They also linked the physical evidence to him as well. and he was sentenced to 15 and a half years in prison. The crazy part is if Maribel left 2-3 seconds earlier or later, if she had taken 2 or 3 steps in a slightly different direction, the bullet likely never would have hit her. But sadly, we will never know. This is the definition of wrong place, wrong time. Sadly. Rest in peace, Maribel. Is advised, by the way. Also, I'm interrupting your regularly scheduled programs to let you know, please pay no mind to the sequential order of these videos, like number 1, number 2. The first like 8 are numbered, but at some point on TikTok, I just stopped counting them. So then you'll see like random numbers pop up. So these are in no particular order. Just a heads up in case you were like confused, like, oh my God, there's number 9's missing. Ah! So anyway, get back to it, I guess. Have fun. Okay, bye. This is a worst freak accident that caused 3 people to die, 2 of which were by decapitation. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. This particular story took place in 1982 on the set of Twilight Zone, the movie. On July 23rd, 1982, they were filming near Santa Clarita, California. And they were filming a portion of the movie that was taking place in Vietnam. Actor Vic Morrow was filming a sequence where he and 2 children were escaping a Vietnamese village. And they were attempting to get to a helicopter, which would be their rescue. He was filming with these 2 child actors, 7-year-old Micah Din Lee and 6-year-old Renee Shin Yi Chen. When they got to the set where the helicopter was, and yes, of course, it was a real helicopter, it was hovering 24 feet in the air. So they had set off a couple of pyrotechnics near the helicopter, and the explosions, this says, delaminated the rotor blades. So what that did was then the helicopter then plummeted to the ground. Renee Shin Yi Chen was crushed because the helicopter landed directly on her. And then Vic Morrow and Micah Din Lee, they had come into contact with the still going blades of the helicopter. And unfortunately, both of them had their heads cut off by the blades. And then both of their bodies would continue to be mutilated, essentially, by the blades until they got it to stop. There was a trial where 5 total people were charged with involuntary manslaughter, but all 5 of them were found not guilty. The children's parents were able to settle an undisclosed amount of money out of court, I believe from the film studio, and then Vic Morrow's children sued them as well, and they also received an unknown settlement. The deadliest maritime freak accident was not the Titanic. Have you heard of the Doña Paz? Hello, true crimerers. This is Worst Freak Accidents number 9. Pictured behind me was the Doña Paz. It was built in 1963 in Hiroshima, Japan. And in 1975, it was sold to the Philippines, which then they in turn turned it into a passenger ferry. Now, she was meant to only carry 1,518 passengers. She would also typically have about 60 to 70 crew members. On December 20th, 1987, around 6:30 in the morning, the Doña Paz would depart from a city called Tacloban, and it would be on its way to Manila. It would be reported later that the Doña Paz did not have a working radio aboard, so communication obviously wasn't happening. But about 10:30 p.m. that evening, the ferry was last seen at a place called Dumali Point. And then she pulled out of port, and she would never port anywhere again. Also in the waters that evening was an oil tanker called Vector, and it was carrying 1,148 tons of gasoline. Sometime in the middle of the night, while the passengers were primarily asleep, and the night sky was reportedly very clear, even though the waters were a little choppy, the Vector would collide with the Doña Paz. When this happened, a fire broke out on the Vector, which was made even worse by the fact that it was carrying primarily gasoline. That fire quickly spread to the Doña Paz. A few witnesses would say they felt and heard a massive explosion, and people were panicking like crazy everywhere. The fire on both vessels spread insanely quickly. Neither ship had a chance. Within minutes, all of the lights on the Doña Paz completely went out. The crew members aboard were running around like chickens with their heads cut off, panicking as well, not knowing what to do. There were no life jackets because allegedly they were all locked up. The crew wasn't giving any orders. People were jumping off the ship, which by the way is shark-infested water. Within an hour, another ship in the area called the Don Claudio was basically right there with them. But the Doña Paz had no chance. It was 100% engulfed in flames, and she sank to the ocean floor in about 2 to 3 hours. The Vector also sank. Only 2 survivors from the Vector. Only 24 survivors from the Doña Paz. 4,385 people died that night. 2,000 passengers weren't even on the manifest. They were way overboarded. The Vector would be blamed for the accident. Financial settlements happened. There she is. Worst freak accidents number 10. This one's about Bubblegum. Hello, true crimerers. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes place in a little town in Ukraine called Konotop. And this was 25-year-old Vladimir Lokonos. He was studying at the Kiev Polytechnical Institute, and on December 20th, 2009, he was living at home with his mother. And that's the day that something really horrible happened. Vladimir very much enjoyed chewing on bubblegum. Now, Vladimir did something interesting with his gum. This is something I have never heard of someone doing before. To apparently extend the flavor of the gum, he would dip it in citric acid. I don't know the science behind it, and I also don't know how long it prolongs the flavor of the gum. Well, Vladimir was working at his desk. His mother was just in the other room when all of a sudden she heard a very loud explosion. She turned to look over at Vladimir, and he was on the ground with blood everywhere. His entire jaw, in fact, the lower part of his face, was gone. Reportedly, the scene was so graphic and so gruesome that the responding authorities who went to care for him, they couldn't handle it. It was that bad. They said it was something they had never seen before. So what happened? So, he usually dips his gum into citric acid. Well, on his workstation, there was another powder, because he was working on some sort of experiment. There was about 3.5 ounces of this other white substance, this white powder, that I don't think has actually been revealed as to what it actually was. This is a picture of ammonium nitrate, just to give you kind of like a reference, but it's not confirmed to be this substance. So instead of dipping it in the citric acid, he accidentally dipped it in the explosive powder. And when he put it into his mouth, when it mixed with the acid and saliva, it basically became an explosive. It became exploding bubblegum. And within just a few moments of chewing down, it blew off the entire lower portion of his face. And yes, he did die. They had to call in a bomb squad to check the rest of the apartment, which they didn't find anything of danger or anything like that. But, I mean, this is kind of the definition of freak accident, because he obviously just probably wasn't paying attention. He was probably like got his gum, just dip, didn't notice what he was doing, and then all of a sudden his face is gone. I only hope that his experience was instant and he didn't feel anything. But I feel horrible for his mother who had to see that. Jesus Christ. This is awful. A Halloween night of fun and festivities in 1963 would end in a catastrophic and deadly explosion. Hello, true crimerers. This is a Worst Freak Accidents Halloween edition. This is the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum. It was a chilly Halloween night in 1963. Inside the Coliseum was a Holiday on Ice show. Just a few moments after 11 p.m. on that Halloween night in 1963, with only 3 minutes remaining on the final act of the show, an unexpected catastrophe would occur. In the concession area, there was a rusty propane tank, and little did anyone know, it was leaking gas. That gas had begun to slowly fill up the unventilated room. As the finale of the show was ramping up, the gas would come into contact with an electric popcorn machine. And then, in an instant, the gas ignited. And then it was described as a blast of orange flame shot 40 feet into the air, which catapulted through the south side seats, and anyone sitting in those seats, they were launched into the air, as were all of the chairs and the concrete flooring. Witnesses described chunks of concrete raining from the ceiling, and body parts also falling from the ceiling. Even the people who weren't sitting directly above where the explosion came through, even they were kind of thrust forward, and many of the people in the stands were then thrown onto the ice. And then several other people, because right here is a crater, when they flew up into the air, they then came back down into that now formed crater. And when they fell into the crater, the concrete would then land on top of them. To those who did not die instantly from the explosion, many were crushed by the concrete. Many people suffocated because of the concrete laying on top of them. And reportedly 54 people had died right there at the scene. 20 more people would die later at the hospital. 400 other people were seriously injured. I want to give you a trigger warning for this next image. Everyone's covered by blankets, but I just wanted to let you know the Coliseum was essentially turned into a makeshift morgue until they were able to get everyone out. But that took, unfortunately, a very long time. Many people were buried under very, very heavy concrete. When the explosion initially happened, they said the entire crowd went silent, and then after a few moments of silence, it all erupted into chaos and screams. The band even kept playing, not realizing what happened. Surviving victims received $4.6 million in settlements. 17 people would lose their lives during a freak accident that could have and should have been avoided. Hello, true crimerers. This is another worst freak accidents. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here behind me is the beautiful Table Rock Lake, which is located in Branson, Missouri. Shortly after 11 a.m. on July 19th, 2018, there would be a severe thunderstorm alert in this area. A warning that continued throughout the day. In fact, they would reiterate the thunderstorm warning around 6:35 p.m. Pictured here is a duck boat. It's an amphibious boat with wheels that you can drive right into a body of water. They were originally used for military transport, especially during World War II, and also throughout the Korean War. There were so many of these things in excess that they were able to be purchased and turned into tourist boats. On July 19th, 2018, 31 people would be aboard one of these boats. The captain of this particular vessel seemed to just ignore the thunderstorm warnings because these boats aren't really designed to withstand heavy storms. Sometime shortly before 7 p.m. that day, the captain with his many passengers drove right into Table Rock Lake. A few minutes after 7 p.m., several 911 calls would be made. You see, because the thunderstorms that they had been given warnings about all day long, guess what? They hit. The lake would begin to have giant swells. There were waves about 4 or 5 feet high. This is an actual image of the duck boat in question in the lake at that time. There are videos that you can actually see where the water is literally going above the roof of this thing. The side panels there were fixed like windows, so there weren't any openings to get out. But there was enough opening for water to get in. This particular duck boat was flooded within moments. And then just a few moments later, she was gone. The boat was now fully submerged in water and it sunk. 14 people, including the captain of the boat, managed to escape. The same could not be said for 17 others. That evening, they would pull out 13 bodies from the water. That included 9 members of this family. This was taken just before they went out on the water. This was the driver of the boat. He lost his life. And this is an image of all of those who died that day. The remaining 4 bodies were found and pulled out the following day. Now, originally, the captain was charged with many charges. but those were later dropped because they should have been federal charges. Just last year, federal charges were applied, and a trial is still waiting. A gas leak at a pesticide plant in India would lead to more deaths than any other industrial accident in human history. Hello, true crimerers. This is another episode of Worst Freak Accidents. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured behind me was the Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant, and it was located in Bhopal, India. On December 2nd, 1984, while trying to unclog a pipe, water had entered that pipe and went into tank E610. That tank was holding 42 tons of methyl isocyanate, or MIC gas. This would create a runaway exothermic reaction, and the pressure in that tank had reached 10 psi. Some of the workers were like, oh, that reading, that's it's an instrumental malfunction. We're fine. Just before midnight on December 2nd, some of the workers were actually starting to experience the effects of being exposed to MIC gas. So they started looking for a leak. They found one. They told their supervisor. Supervisor said, let's go take a tea break and then we'll address the issue after that. Yeah, that was a poor decision. At 12:40 a.m., just a few minutes after their tea break ended, temperatures inside the tanks were off the grid. The reaction inside the tank was at a critical level. The pressure inside the tank has now reached 55 psi. And then pictured behind me, within 45 minutes, 30 tons of the MIC gas had begun to release into the atmosphere. 2 hours later, it was now at 40 tons. The wind would then carry the gases southeast over Bhopal. The local warning siren rang for a few moments, but then they turned that off to not cause a panic. Pretty sure this causes a panic on its own. All of the workers, of course, were now fleeing the factory, and they were running for their lives. This is a very lethal gas. Symptoms of being exposed to this gas would first start with coughing, eye irritation, the feeling of suffocating, breathlessness, the burning feeling of your respiratory system, and vomiting. Bhopal was now covered in a cloud of this gas. By morning, thousands of people were dead. They died of choking, pulmonary edema, circulatory collapses, sudden onset kidney failure. Over the next several months, it would leave 3,900 people with disabling injuries, claim the lives of 16,000 people, 558,000 people had non-fatal injuries. There was a 300% stillbirth rate amongst pregnant women, and a 200% rate of babies dying shortly after birth. It also caused permanent health issues in thousands of people. Children born with disabilities. Guess who is held criminally responsible? No one. The images you are about to see behind me are from the aftermath of one of the worst freak accidents imaginable. Hello, true crimerers. This is the story of the Enschede fireworks disaster. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes place in the little Dutch city of Enschede, which is located in the Netherlands. And on May 13th, 2000, a disaster would strike. Behind me is what was once the SE Fireworks Depot. And these were concrete bunkers that they were using to store their fireworks. There was capacity to hold roughly 18 tons worth of fireworks. Well, as with any story that I talk about that leads to a freak accident, they overfilled those bunkers. They would even add shipping containers to store more. So by the time that this story begins, they are at 10 times the capacity. Just before this disaster happened, this depot was actually audited, and they said it passed their regulations. But the people who lived in the area, they said that this place was a disaster waiting to happen. When this depot was built, it was kind of on its own, but at the time of this story, there was now housing developments all around it. Sometime around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on May 13th, 2000, a small fire would start in one of the bunkers. How did that fire start? No one seems to know, but the fire spread quickly. Another issue that presented itself was the complex had fire safety doors that would have contained a fire, but they were left open on that day. And the shipping containers they added, they weren't separated. There was no concrete or fire safety in between each one. So the fire started in one of the concrete bunkers, and then it spread to one of the shipping containers. And then, well, this that I just showed you. One of the bunkers then had an explosion. And then that explosion spread to the next bunker, causing a chain reaction of explosions. The explosion was so intense that it just went through the entire surrounding area. The shockwave alone was felt by everyone in the neighborhoods nearby. And this is what those explosions left in its wake. I mean, this created a crater, and it destroyed so much. 22 people would die in the explosions, including 4 firemen. A little under 1,000 people had to be hospitalized with injuries. 400 different houses were destroyed completely. 1,500 buildings were destroyed. The final explosion was measured at 5,000 kilograms of TNT. The blast was felt up to 19 miles away. 2 of the owners were arrested, and they got a 12-month prison sentence each, and victims were compensated. This is another episode of Worst Freak Accidents, and it is about bungee jumping. Hello, true crimerers. This is the story of Yesenia Morales Gomez. Viewer discretion is advised. Yesenia was actually a 25-year-old lawyer living in Antioquia, Colombia. And on July of 2021, her and her boyfriend would decide to go bungee jumping, and this would be her first time trying it. They would go to the Amaga Viaduct, which is in northern Colombia, and it's a very popular spot for bungee jumping. The top of the bridge to the ground below is roughly 165 feet. Now, when it was their turn, coming up soon, the members of the Sky Bungee Jumping Company would begin to put on their harnesses. At that point, Yesenia was not attached to any cord. She just had the harness on. So her boyfriend had been attached to the bungee cord. Now, the instructor gave her boyfriend the signal to jump, because he was ready. Yesenia, they assume, misread the signal, and she didn't hear that it wasn't for her. So she jumped off the bridge, thinking that the instructor was telling her to go. And again, she wasn't attached to anything. From what I understand, her boyfriend jumped because he got the signal, but then she jumped as well, and she would plummet 164 feet, and she would land on the rocky terrain below. The autopsy would later show that Yesenia likely died of heart failure, meaning that on the way down, she must have realized she wasn't attached, and she died of actual fright. She died of a heart attack. What's crazy to me is 164 feet, when you're just free falling, isn't that long of a drop time-wise. Now, being in that situation, I probably would also want to die of a heart attack before having to face hitting the ground. But I just wonder if that can happen that quickly. But according to the coroner, it did. Now, to give you just a quick statistic, and even with this stat, I still will never go bungee jumping in my life because I am not a thrill seeker. But here in the United States, over the past 20 years, there has only been 23 deaths related to bungee jumping. It is normally a very safe practice, even if you have to have a few screws loose upstairs to do it. Now, from what I understand, the bungee jumping company that was involved in this is being investigated because it's possible they were they weren't authorized to be there, from rumors. I don't know if there's an outcome to that investigation yet, because it literally just happened, 6-7 months ago. But still, be careful out there. 14 people died tragically in an accident that could have easily been avoided. Hello, true crimerers. This is a national parks case known as the Cave Creek Platform Collapse. Viewer discretion is advised. This story takes place at the beautiful Paparoa National Park, which is located in New Zealand. On Friday, April 28, 1995, 20 people from Tai Pautini Polytechnic attended the park. They were there to study the landscape of the park. They also had a Department of Conservation field officer with them. The group of 20 had split off into 2 separate groups. Now, the larger of the 2 groups was walking along the south track, and they would get to a viewing platform. It looked very similar to this one. So essentially, it's kind of hanging over an open area. And that way you could view the beauty below and around you. Now, this group that consisted of 18 people had fully gotten onto this platform. Sometime around 11:30 in the morning, they were on the platform when a couple of students were just joking around and sort of shaking the platform. You know, they were trying to scare other people by saying, "Oh, it's shaky." Well, the entire platform gave out. First, it began to sway back and forth, and then it tilted, and then essentially right at this part here, it just severed and it collapsed. It fell approximately 40 meters, or about 130 feet. It basically launched forward and it crashed through trees and bushes and landed directly on rocks. The platform itself stayed completely intact. The smaller group heard a whole bunch of crunching noises and screams, so they rushed over to see what happened. They looked down and they saw absolute carnage. 10 of the people were killed instantly. 6 of them would survive the initial fall. This is at a time before cell phones. So one of the students, Mark Trainer, he bolted to the parking lot, got onto a bike, and then bicycled 8 kilometers to get help. Sadly, by the time paramedics got there, 2 more of the people who had initially survived passed away, and then 2 more died later at the hospital. The rescue operation was very difficult, because there was just simply no easy way to get down there. So they had to use helicopters to lower people in, to bring people up. It was time consuming. This wasn't the fault of the kids who were shaking the platform. The platform, which was built a year prior, was not designed by engineers. It was not constructed by anyone who was an engineer. Instead of using the recommended bolts to put this together, they decided to use nails. The stairs weren't properly attached. The platform was never inspected. No one was held criminally responsible, but the victims' families were paid $2.6 million. Disaster would strike on Christmas Eve 1953 in New Zealand. The lives of many were lost. Hello, true crimerers. This is another Christmas story, and it is a worst freak accidents. Viewer discretion is advised. At around 3 p.m. on December 24th, 1953, a steam locomotive with 11 carriages would leave Wellington in New Zealand. It was on its way to Auckland. On board were about 285 people. This is Mount Rapu. At some point during the early evening, 2 million cubic meters of water from a lake inside the crater, well, it was released from the crater, and it created a 6-meter high, or about 19 feet high, wave. And this was a wave consisting of water and ice and rock. They estimate that at some point between 10:10 and 10:15 p.m., that wave traveled down the Wangahu River and eventually crashed into the concrete pylons at the Tongawai Railway Bridge. This is obviously the current bridge. Now, the force of this was so bad that it actually dislodged parts of the bridge that were keeping it held up. And around 10:20 p.m., the locomotive that we talked about at the beginning would pass over that bridge when the bridge collapsed. And what followed was a terrifying and catastrophic disaster. When the bridge collapsed, the engine of the train went with it. And then with that, it took all 5 of the second-class carriages with it, which then brought the leading first-class carriage to the front of that bridge, where it was teetering on the edge. That carriage then snapped off from the rest of the train and collapsed below. And then it kind of rolled down a ways. The remaining carriages had managed to stay above. Before that first-class carriage fell down below, they managed to actually get a bunch of the passengers into the carriage behind it, which saved a lot of lives. They were getting passengers out through broken windows, so before that carriage eventually broke and fell into the water below, they managed to save everyone but one person. Unfortunately, there was a young girl who was trapped inside and she drowned. Sadly, most of the people who were in those first handful of carriages that collapsed below, most of them sadly died. There was 151 total deaths in this disaster. Sadly, there were about 20 bodies they were never able to find. The bridge has since been rebuilt, and now they have Lahar warning systems in place to warn and prevent any more incidences like this. This was an accident, pure and simple. Therefore, no one was held responsible. It was Mother Nature. Hello, true crimerers. This is another worst freak accidents. And this one is the Schoharie limousine crash. Viewer discretion is advised. On October 6, 2018, Axel Steenberg and his wife Amy were planning a big birthday celebration. Amy was turning 30 years old. Now, originally the plan was to get a big party bus for all of their friends and family. But 2 days prior to the event, the company that was running the bus had to cancel because the bus had broken down. Axel was able to secure a reservation with Prestige Limousine the morning of the event. The stretch limousine they got was a 2001 Ford Excursion, and it was capable of holding 18 passengers plus obviously the driver. Now, the group that was going would be about 17 people, so this was perfect. While in the limousine, one of the passengers, her name was Erin McGowan, she texts a friend that says, "This limousine sounds like it's about to explode," followed by another text that says, "The motor's making everyone deaf." The limo would take them through Schoharie Creek, which is in New York State, by the way, and it was specifically driving down New York State Route 30. It then got to an intersection that had a fairly steep decline, and allegedly the limousine blew through a stop sign at 100 miles per hour. Witnesses said the driver looked dazed and confused, but the limo just kept going, and it managed to swerve from hitting other cars, but then it would fly down the hill and into a parking lot of an Apple Barrel country store where the limo crashed head-on into a Toyota Highlander. It then continued going until it drove into a gully and stopped on its own. The limo also hit 2 pedestrians who were trying to get out of the way. I cannot show you the damage to the limousine, but it is pretty bad. This is just an animated cartoon drawing of what it looked like. All 18 people in the limousine, including the driver and the 2 pedestrians, were killed. 20 people died in a moment. So what the hell happened? Well, the limousine had a brake issue. The brakes malfunctioned. It was a 20-year-old limousine that needed repairs. Weeks prior to this event, they brought it to an auto repair shop where they claimed they fixed the brakes. They didn't. The limousine's owner, Nauman Hussein, he had received multiple state violations about this limousine, that the repairs were highly inadequate. The limousine failed an inspection the month prior. It should have been taken out of service, but he didn't. Hussein never brought the limousine to a state repair shop. He brought it to some random one of his own choosing. The driver, he didn't even have the proper driver's license. He wasn't allowed to be driving a vehicle with more than 15 people. Hussein also knew that. Hussein pled guilty to negligent homicide. He got 5 years probation. 48 people would enter an Irish nightclub on Valentine's Day alive, but they would come out in body bags. Hello, true crimerers. This is another worst freak accidents, and this is the story of the Stardust nightclub fire in Ireland. Viewer discretion is advised. This is what the front of the Stardust nightclub would have looked like. This building was constructed in 1948, and in 1978, the Stardust nightclub would open. The nightclub had a dance floor, it had a couple of bars. It was a large place. It could accommodate several hundred people. And on February 14th, 1981, there were roughly 841 people inside the nightclub. They were holding a St. Valentine's disco event. No. Around 1:30 in the morning, people would notice little fires kind of scattered throughout the building. The cause of the fire was believed to be electrical. The storage room of this building had 45 5-gallon drums of cooking oil. So once the fire hits that area, it's done. They did attempt to use fire extinguishers because at that point the fires were still pretty small, but this wasn't working. The fire then broke through the roof tiles and began to infiltrate the west alcove part of the building, which could house somewhere around 300 people. It then began to hit the seating area, which had polyester fabric. It then spread to the wooden tables, the wooden chairs. At 1:45 a.m., the material of the roof itself was beginning to melt and then drip onto patrons. And also all of the flammable materials, and then a flashover occurred. The flashover would go through the entire building almost, and it caused the lights to go out. Most of the fire exits were locked by chain, or at the very least, they were blocked. What is the point of having emergency exits then? Panic obviously set in, then the trampling began. A lot of people who were running towards the entrance got lost in all the smoke and ended up in the bathrooms, and they got trapped. People were running everywhere, they had no idea where to go. It wasn't until 1:51 a.m. when the first fire truck got there. And when it was all said and done, these 48 people lost their lives. 214 other people experienced non-fatal injuries. At first, this was reported as an arson, but then after an investigation, they realized, no, this was an electrical fire. But then they said, no, this wasn't an accident. They would go back and forth with this. And to this day, the actual true cause is unknown, and likely will never be known. The owners of the nightclub were compensated. The victims' families were not.